In the halls of a civilization that spanned stars, the princess stood as a symbol of pride and superiority. Her people had reigned for centuries, and to them, humanity was little more than filth dragged from the mud of a backwater world. She had been raised to sneer at the very idea that a human could stand beside her, much less claim the title of mate. Yet politics had no patience for pride. An alliance was demanded, and her council made their choice without her consent. She would take a human warrior as consort, a living symbol of cooperation. To her, it was humiliation disguised as duty. The human arrived not as a noble, not even as a dignitary, but as a soldier pulled from the blood-soaked front lines. He was chosen for one reason alone: survival. He had endured when his comrades had fallen, and his stubborn refusal to yield had become a story whispered through both armies. To the princess, that only meant he was a curiosity, filth that refused to wash away. His scars were proof of brutality, not honor. His silence at the ceremony was an insult to her grandeur. She saw him as crude, beneath her notice, a figure meant only to stand at her side like an ornament with no voice. Before the court, she played her role as dutiful bride with venom hidden behind a smile. She mocked him openly, her words sharp enough to draw laughter from her peers. She called him fragile, weak, unworthy of her touch. She spoke as if the very air around him carried contamination, as if his presence was a burden she endured for the sake of empire. The courtiers cheered her wit, believing her every insult a reinforcement of their supremacy. Each barb was designed to strip him of dignity, to remind all who watched that the princess had not lowered herself willingly. Yet the human did not flinch. He stood firm beneath the torrent of mockery, neither bowing his head nor answering in kind. His silence was not submission, it was something colder, heavier, a refusal to acknowledge her cruelty as worthy of reaction. Where she sought humiliation, he gave only steady defiance. It unsettled her, though she would never admit it. His eyes met hers without fear, and in them she found no shame, no trembling need to be accepted. He looked at her as though her words were smoke, fading before they could wound. The court mistook his composure for dullness, laughing harder at his supposed ignorance, but she felt something different beneath the surface. Pride had always been her armor, and mockery her blade, but against this man they failed to strike deep. For every insult, he gave her nothing, no groveling, no protest, no shattered pride to savor. He carried himself with the weight of a soldier who had already endured far worse than words. When the ceremony ended, she dismissed him with a flick of her hand, certain he was nothing more than a tool forced upon her. Yet in the quiet moments that followed, her thoughts returned to the way he had stood, immovable as stone, unshaken by the laughter of an empire. He was meant to be fragile, to break beneath the pressure of her disdain. Instead, he remained whole, and that lingering defiance stirred a question she had never asked before. Perhaps filth did not break so easily after all. She treated him as a shadow in her palace, a silent figure meant to remind her court of the alliance. In public she flaunted her superiority, surrounding herself with attendants who laughed at her barbs, repeating her every insult as if it were sacred truth. To her, he was a symbol, not a partner. In private she believed he would remain silent and docile, like an animal too dull to understand its cage. Yet it was in those quiet chambers that his defiance revealed itself. When she hurled cutting remarks at him away from the ears of others, he did not shrink. He answered, not with rage but with a clear, unshaken voice, speaking of strength, of what it meant to fight without rank or bloodline to protect you. His words carried no polish, but each one struck sharper than she cared to admit. She found herself arranging tests, subtle at first, then blatant, designed to prove his weakness. Endurance trials meant for warriors of her own kind, challenges steeped in cruelty masked as tradition. To her irritation, he endured them all. His body bent but did not break, his breathing harsh but steady long after others would have collapsed. Guards who once jeered began to whisper, uncertain whether to admire or fear his persistence. She hid her unease behind more scorn, telling herself his survival was accident, not proof of worth. Yet in the quiet of her mind, she could not dismiss the sight of him standing bloodied and unbowed. Every insult she hurled began to feel different. Once they rolled easily off her tongue, but now they carried weight she did not intend, echoing in silence after he walked away. He never struck back with cruelty, never begged for mercy, never turned his gaze aside. Instead, he watched her with a steadiness that unsettled her composure. Where others groveled for her approval, he regarded her as though she were merely another adversary, not untouchable, not divine. That equality, unspoken but clear, rattled her more than open defiance ever could. The fracture widened during one confrontation when she unleashed a torrent of words meant to shatter what remained of his pride. She called him unworthy, mocked his scars, sneered at his humanity. He listened without flinching, then answered with quiet honesty that struck harder than her sharpest venom. He told her she mocked what she did not understand, that fragility was not weakness, that survival was not luck. He spoke of battles fought without shields of privilege, of comrades buried in silence, of victories won only because surrender was never an option. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of truth that her pride could not shield against. Alone in her chambers later, she replayed his words against her will. She tried to dismiss them, tried to convince herself that he was still beneath her, but her conviction faltered. For the first time in her life, her pride felt uncertain, her armor cracked by a man who refused to kneel. She had mocked him as filth, but filth did not endure fire without turning to ash. What she faced was something else, something her people had not prepared her to confront. Against her will, she began to wonder if the strength she mocked was the very thing her empire lacked. The threat against her life came suddenly, a strike born from factions within her own people who despised the alliance. Assassins slipped through shadows, blades drawn for royal blood. Yet it was not her guards who saved her, but the very human she had mocked. He fought with a ferocity that left even seasoned killers staggering back, a storm of raw willpower and grit. Wounded, bleeding, but unrelenting, he threw himself between her and death without hesitation. When the danger passed, she saw him battered but standing, and for the first time her laughter failed her. He had risked everything, not for power or recognition, but for her. In the aftermath, she tended to him in secrecy. His blood was strange, his wounds ugly, but his resilience left her breathless. She told herself it was duty that drew her hands to his injuries, but her denial rang hollow. In his silence, in his stubborn refusal to complain, she saw the fire that had carried him through wars and torment. The contempt she once wielded began to erode, replaced by a reluctant fascination. He was not what she had been taught to believe. He was something her people could not define, a strength that did not demand reverence, but inspired it. Their arguments shifted. Once filled with scorn, they became sharper, alive with tension neither could ignore. She pressed him with questions. He answered with truths that burned through the lies of her upbringing. In the spaces between words, in silences charged with something unspoken, her pride faltered. The distance she had forced between them narrowed with every shared glance, every unguarded moment. She found herself studying the lines of his scars, listening to the rough cadence of his voice, searching for excuses to remain in his presence. Desire was a battlefield she had not prepared for. She fought it as fiercely as she fought her enemies, yet the battle was lost before it began. The man she once paraded as a symbol of filth had become a flame in her veins. When their barriers finally crumbled, it was not humiliation she felt, but a raw, undeniable truth. This human was no ornament, no shadow. He was her equal, the first to meet her not as princess, but as woman. Weeks passed before she felt the change within her body, the quiet certainty that life had taken root. When the truth came, it struck like thunder. She bore his heir, a child that was neither fully alien nor fully human, but something entirely new. Fear wrapped around her as tightly as awe. This was not merely a private matter of flesh and blood. This was history written inside her, a living symbol that could bind empires or tear them apart. Alone, She pressed her hand against her stomach, pride and dread warring within. She had mocked him before the court, sworn he was unworthy of her. Yet now she carried his legacy, a truth no amount of scorn could erase. In that moment, she understood the depth of her own hypocrisy. What she had dismissed as filth had become the seed of a future her people would never accept. And yet, for the first time, she did not feel shame. She felt the weight of destiny. The news of her condition spread faster than whispers could be silenced. In the grand court where her voice had once carried mockery, she now stood accused. Nobles spat venom cloaked as honor, calling her womb tainted, her bloodline broken by human filth. Some demanded the child's removal before it could draw breath, others whispered of exile. The scandal was fire to those who already opposed the alliance, and many saw her as a traitor to her kind. She had been their pride, but now they painted her as weakness embodied. The human did not falter. Where others expected him to shrink, he stood unyielding, his voice carrying through the hall with a strength that defied their scorn. He claimed the child as his own, not with arrogance, but with absolute certainty. He dared any to lay hand on it, knowing death would follow. His defiance silenced even seasoned warriors who had laughed at him months before. For the first time, commoners who had always watched from the shadows began to whisper respect, for here was a man who stood against an empire for what was his. She watched, torn between fear and pride, as her people's wrath sharpened into daggers aimed at them both. Once she might have stood with the court, distancing herself from him to protect her image. But that path was gone. She had seen him bleed for her, shield her, endure her cruelty without breaking. She had seen him stand tall when every voice sought to grind him down. The child she carried was no curse, no abomination. It was proof of something greater than her people's arrogance. It was a bond stronger than politics, born from defiance and sealed in fire. At the council's peak of fury, when voices called for blood and her silence would have meant betrayal, she rose beside him. Her words cut through the chamber like a blade. She declared that the child within her was heir to both peoples, that the bloodline they mocked was the future their empire needed. She stripped away their laughter with the weight of her conviction, telling them their obsession with purity had blinded them to true strength. Her scorn, once directed at him, now turned against her own court, and in that reversal she shattered their illusion of superiority. When another attempt was made on his life, carried out brazenly within those very halls, it was not the human who struck first, but her. Before all, she cut down the assassin with a swiftness that silenced every tongue. The message was clear: she no longer stood apart from him. Their survival was bound together, and she would kill her own kind before allowing the bond to be broken. It was the moment her people could no longer dismiss him as filth. To challenge him now was to challenge her, and to challenge her was to risk rebellion from those who had begun to see truth in her words. The storm did not vanish. Enemies remained, whispers endured, but the tide had shifted. She, once the voice of mockery, now stood as the shield of the man she had scorned. The human who had arrived as a political pawn had become a pillar, not by demanding reverence, but by enduring it all without bending. And she, who had once despised the very thought of him, now carried his heir with a pride fiercer than her court's contempt. Together they walked from the chamber, not as princess and consort, not as noble and ornament, but as equals bound by a child who represented more than either empire had dared to dream. What began as scorn had become destiny. Humanity, once dismissed as filth, now stood beside an empire as its future.